In the year 1791, the people of a small town in Provence, southern France, decided to move the remains of their most famous citizen to a more fitting final resting place. For over 200 years, he had been buried as he wished, standing up in the wall of a small church in the center of the town. It is said that when his tomb was opened, the citizens could not resist the temptation to search through its contents. After all, this had been no ordinary man, and stories of his mysterious powers had become legend throughout Europe. It was believed that he could see the future. They found an amulet around the neck of the skeleton with an inscription. It read 1791, the very year the tomb was opened. The man's name was Michel de Nostradam, better known as Nostradamus. It is claimed by some that he predicted, among other things, the rise of Hitler, Kennedy's assassination, and the French Revolution. Born in 1503, he is the most famous prophet of the 16th century, in many ways the golden age of prophecy in the West. The world is a dangerous and uncertain place. Time and time again, we find ourselves at the mercy of forces outside our control. However hard we try to anticipate what lies ahead, most of us accept that when it comes to the future, we are blind. Prophets and seers offer salvation from uncertainty. They tell us the story of what lies ahead, seeing in the present not only traces of our past, but images of our future. But at the hands of the modern scientific worldview, prophecy has suffered the same fate as magic, alchemy, and astrology.
Well, mow me down. He's having his fortune told.
People who accept the possibility of seeing into the future are on the margins of accepted belief, if not outside it altogether.
Do not swim in the ocean. That would be fatal.
But prophecy has been with us from the earliest times. In the great ancient civilizations, it played a central role in people's lives. Its influence was never greater than in classical Greece. The towering achievements of Greek civilization were built on the foundations of earlier primitive cultures, and traces of these are never far below the surface. First and foremost, it inherited an unquestioning belief in prophecy. And even during the greatest flowering of this remarkable civilization, prophecy kept its position at the center of Greek life. The most sacred form of prophecy was the oracle, a shrine where the gods were thought to answer questions about the future. And none was more famous than the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. Built on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, Delphi was consulted by people from Greece and beyond for almost 1,000 years.
The crucial person in the operation was the priestess, the Pythia. Now she is a medium. She's not somebody who operates in her own right. Through her, the god speaks directly. Before you asked your question of Apollo, there was quite an elaborate process. The priestess had to purify herself in various ways and work herself up somehow or other into an ecstatic state. she utters a... We don't know exactly what she said or how it came out. She may have spoken in tongues or something like that. But what she said was interpreted by the priest. He converted her meaningless noise or whatever it was into hexameter verse, which was then written down for you, and you had your answer.
As the Greek city-states expanded into new territories, Delphi became a crucial stop on the road to war and empire. But the pronouncements of the oracle could often be misleading. One great king, Croesus, asked the oracle if he should attack the Persian Empire. He was told, "If you go to war, you will destroy a great kingdom." Encouraged by this, he went into battle. His army was utterly defeated. The great kingdom he destroyed was his own. The one disaster that Delphi could not foresee was its own fall from prominence. With the rise of Christianity, there emerged the belief in one all-powerful creator with a unified plan for humanity. Prophets like Abraham, Moses, and Christ were ethical guides who revealed this vision to the people. Their message was powerful. Obey the word of God, and the future will be glorious. Ignore it, and the consequences will be catastrophic. In the centuries following Christ's death, Christianity spread across the globe, carrying the tradition of biblical prophecy into a new age. Nowhere was the power and influence of Christian prophecy greater than Europe in the 16th century. At this time, there was also a resurgence of interest in the ancient arts. Alchemy, magic, and astrology fused with the Christian tradition. No one embodied these influences more than Michel de Nostredame. Michel de Nostredame did not begin writing the prophecies for which he is so famous today until late in life. But as a young man, he had already made a name for himself, fighting one of the worst catastrophes to afflict Europe for 1,000 years, the Black Death. The bubonic plague swept through the continent, causing misery and claiming millions of lives, ultimately 1/3 of Europe's population. The people were defenseless. Death and disease were rampant. Neither prayer nor medicine had any impact. At the age of 22, Michel de Nostredame qualified as a doctor, and following the custom of the time, took the Latinized form of his name, Nostradamus. He then spent several years traveling in Provence and elsewhere to wherever there was an outbreak of the plague. His approach to treating the disease was unusual. He did not believe in bleeding his patients. Instead, he prescribed treatments that would not become accepted until years after his death.
The really interesting thing was he insisted that his patients followed a hygiene regime. And there was absolutely nothing in his background that would have taught him to do this. There was no knowledge of hygiene in his culture. There was no thought that this could have anything to do with illness. And yet he insisted on clean bedding. He insisted that the patients took fresh air, took exercise and so forth. And the result was that he was successful where other doctors weren't.
Word of this spread far and wide. Towns across Europe requested his help. Tragically, for all his medical vision, he could not save his own wife and child from this disease. The magnitude of suffering is hard to imagine, and for people in the 16th century, it had particularly sinister and horrifying connotations. People saw in its devastation the very wrath of God. The hand of death was everywhere Nostradamus traveled. What had man done wrong? What was God trying to say? Nostradamus must have asked himself these questions. He must have tried to read the signs. From his time as a traveling doctor comes a story which links the forward-thinking physician with the prophet he would become. While walking near the town of Ancona in Italy, Nostradamus passed two monks on the road. When asked what he was doing, Nostradamus would only say, "I must kneel before His Holiness." The monk, Brother Felice Peretti, was at the time still a novice. 19 years later, Peretti would become Pope. In 1547, at the age of 44, Nostradamus settled down and remarried. Making what seems to be a dramatic change in his career, he converted the attic room of his house into a study and began to write prophecy.
There is an absolute continuity, I think, between his background training, I suppose, and his prophetic interest. Because in those days, when you were trained as a doctor, one of the most important aspects of your training was training in astrology.
Astrology grew from the belief that the movements and cycles of the heavenly bodies influence the cycles of life on Earth. A complex system was developed describing the effects of the sun, the moon, and the various planets on the world below. In theory, by drawing up a horoscope, a map of the heavens for some time in the future, you could work out what the planetary influences at that time would be. Astrology evolved into a method of prediction. In the 16th century, astrology played a part in almost all areas of science, not least medicine.
You had associations between various planetary systems, heavenly bodies, and various parts of the body, so that it was a diagnostic aid. And then you had associations between the planetary bodies and certain herbs and nostrums, so it was an aid to treatment. You diagnosed through astrology, you treated through astrology. But of course, astrology is primarily a predictive art. And consequently, anybody who learns astrology learns, if you like, the art of prediction. So that when he was learning medicine, he was laying, I think, the foundations for his prophetic career.
But prophecy and astrology are two different things. Unlike astrologers who get their predictions from a theory, prophets claim to have direct experience of the future. Prophecy is a form of revelation. In his writings, Nostradamus makes this clear.
Only those inspired by divine power can foretell particular events, for they alone are capable of prophecy.
Nostradamus' background holds a clue to the puzzle of how he set about bringing himself into contact with this divine power.
He was, by race and by blood, if not by religion, Jewish. His grandparents, on both sides of the family, were Jewish. They were forcibly converted. Being Jewish wasn't terribly popular in those days. It's also known that Nostradamus studied with his maternal grandfather. And there is a clear suggestion from his writings, and more particularly from his life and his practices, that among the things he studied may well have been Kabbalah.
Kabbalah is the secret mystical element in Jewish thought and practice. It has its roots in an ancient oral tradition, which focused on parts of the Old Testament believed to hold the key to the inner mysteries of the universe. Kabbalists believe that God left an imprint of his plan for all creation in every human being. It is as if each of us carried within himself a fragment of universal DNA. The aim of the Kabbalist is to decode the revelations that God has stamped on his soul. The practice of Kabbalah involves repetition of Hebrew words, particularly the names of God, which are believed to have supernatural power. At the heart of the system is the Tree of Life. This is a representation of the whole order of creation and is used as a focus for meditation. The rituals are used to reach an altered state of consciousness, in which the Kabbalist has a sense of rising above the ordinary world of the senses. Only then can he achieve the highest goal, a direct experience of the divine. In this state, Kabbalists claim to be freed from the chains of linear time. They talk of reaching the level of prophecy, of experiencing the eternal now, in which all of time is contained. Nostradamus' writings suggest that through his rituals, he experienced similar states.
In the presence of divine grace and power, past, present, and future become but one eternity, for all things are naked and open.
You can picture the scene of him sitting, one imagines, in a semi-darkened study. Semi-darkened because he would have practiced this very much in secret. It was a very, very, very dangerous occupation. The Inquisition were on the lookout for sorcery, and even Nostradamus' own reputation would not have saved him from a very embarrassing situation had he been found out, and possibly wouldn't have saved him from death. So this would have been practiced very secretly, very quietly. We know, for example, that it involved a bowl of water. We know that it involved a brass tripod, and may very possibly have involved narcotics, herbal narcotics, which he would have been quite familiar with from his medical practice, probably burned in the form of incense.
Sitting by night in my secret study, alone, resting upon the tripod of brass, a slight flame coming out of the solitude makes me pronounce what is not to be disbelieved. The wand in hand set in the middle of the branches, from the wave I wet both the hem and the foot. In fear I write, trembling in the sleeves, divine splendor, the divine seated nearby.
It's very, very difficult for us today to really get into the mindset that was current then. You go to church on a Sunday and you hear very easy talk about the divine, but Nostradamus wasn't talking about the divine in a wishy-washy way. He could see the spook. He could actually see the god. This thing was there in front of him. It was walking towards him. It was sitting in the chair. And most importantly, it was telling him about the future of humanity. It was dictating the prophecies.
In 1558, Nostradamus published a book of prophecies called The Centuries, written as cryptic four-line poems or quatrains. One of the quatrains was believed at the time to predict the death of Henry II, the King of France. It was this prophecy that would make Nostradamus famous.
The young lion will overcome the old in a field of combat in single fight. He will pierce his eyes in a golden cage, 2 wounds in one. Then he dies a cruel death.
1 year after this prophecy was published, King Henry took part in a jousting tournament just outside Paris. He competed against Captain Montgomery, a much younger man.
They had a couple of fairly uneventful jousts. And then the disaster happened. Montgomery's lance shattered when it hit the king's armour. And 2 splinters pierced. One of them pierced the king's throat. The other one went through his visor, which was a golden visor, and pierced his eye and penetrated the brain. He lasted 10 full days in agony before he eventually died from his wounds. So you had the old lion. Henri had a lion on his shield. The young lion, Montgomery, oddly enough, had a lion on his shield.
The young lion will overcome the old.
You had the field of combat, the tournament field.
In a field of combat in single fight.
You had the golden cage with the visor.
He will pierce his eyes in a golden cage.
You had 2 wounds in one, the throat and the eye.
2 wounds in one, then he dies a cruel death.
And you had the long, lingering, what Nostradamus called cruel death.
Even the most skeptical would find it hard to dismiss this quatrain as mere coincidence. But very few of the prophecies lend themselves to such clear interpretation.
Interpreters who say that this describes the space race or the Cuban Missile Crisis or the collapse of the Soviet Union are rather like old men looking at pictures in the fire. You project whatever you want into them, and the quatrains are vague enough and woolly enough and difficult enough to sustain that.
But there remain some extraordinary examples which are hard to ignore and which continue to draw people to study the quatrains. One of these relates to an event that happened almost 250 years after Nostradamus died. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were King and Queen of France when the French Revolution began in 1789.
Louis and Marie Antoinette, who had attempted to come to terms with the revolutionaries, eventually saw the writing on the wall at a very, very late hour and tried in essence to make a break for it. And all sorts of things went wrong. And all sorts of things went slowly, mainly because of the king's own stupidity, I suppose. He simply would not face the reality of a situation. But they went to Varennes by a circuitous route, and the king and the queen were turned back.
By night they shall come, by way of the forest of Rennes, a married couple arriving by a circuitous route. One a queen stony white, the king in grey like a monk at Varennes, an elected ruler.
The most stunning line in that quatrain is an elected ruler. Bear in mind that Louis was overthrown by the French Revolution and elected king by the revolutionaries. Although he originally was king by divine right, exactly like every other king of France, he became the first elected monarch.
It shall result in tempest, fire, and bloody slicing.
Towards the end of his life, Nostradamus began to suffer from dropsy. One night in July 1566, he summoned a close friend to his sickbed and told him that this would be their last meeting. The next morning, he was found dead. He was 62 years old. Even now, over 400 years later, his prophecies are still being read and interpreted. The century that Nostradamus lived through was among the most turbulent and violent periods in European history. Bridging the medieval and modern worlds, it was a time of suffering, disorientation, and great change. People looked to prophecy to explain the ever-widening chasm between the chaos on earth and the ideal of order and harmony which God had set out in the heavens. When someone in the 16th century looked into the night sky, in one sense they would have seen exactly the same as someone in the 20th century. But in another sense, they would have seen something very different. For them, the earth was the center of the universe. The sun, the moon, and the planets revolved around it. And the earth was made by God for man. So man took center stage in the great scheme of things. The whole of nature was suffused with meaning. God had a plan, and in it every part of creation had its proper place. In the perfection of the heavens, God seemed to say it all. The stars were believed to be a symbol of the order and harmony he'd devised for his universe, a blueprint for man to follow. People did not see themselves as free to organize their lives as they chose. God had ordained a proper order, and it was man's job to build a society according to the divine plan. As long as things were arranged in line with the will of God, people believed that they would live in peace and harmony and have their needs fulfilled. The peasant in the field, the king in the castle, the planets above him, and God reigning over all. But the ideal of peace and harmony on earth was very different from the reality of life at the time. People experienced war, famine, poverty, and chaos. To the 16th century mind, this was a sign that man was doing something very, very wrong. Sometimes God's anger was most clearly seen in nature itself. Unusual events like comets, eclipses, and natural disasters were understood as prophecies in disguise. God cutting through his natural order, telling mankind to put things right or suffer dire consequences. Traditionally, one of the most powerful warnings from above was the birth of a deformed animal.
Round about this time, there really was something that was very much talked about, which became known as the monk calf. It was a calf which had a bald patch on its head, which made it look like a monk. And people instantly began to interpret this as a warning that the church really was in need of reform.
The monk calf was not far off the mark. The church was supposed to guide people in the ways of God, to be the pure medium of his will. But the church was corrupt. Priests and bishops led lives of debauchery, and at a time of grinding poverty for the people, grew rich by taking money from the poor in return for forgiveness of their sins. A tax on salvation. Events like the birth of the monk calf convinced many that the church was to blame for the disorder of the time. One German priest nailed a scathing list of criticisms to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. Martin Luther attacked the very pinnacle of the church, the Pope himself. He was immediately excommunicated. Luther's actions ignited a religious reformation which would give birth to Protestantism and rip the medieval Christian world apart. Soon, Luther and the church were engaged in a bitter struggle for public support. It was prophecy which would prove to be one of Luther's most potent weapons. In his own translation of the Bible, he turned a famous prophecy into a taunting, derisive attack on the Pope. The prophecy predicted the coming of the whore of Babylon, riding on a beast with 7 heads.
Traditionally, the last book of the New Testament, which was the book of Revelation, was very heavily illustrated. There were standard images of the destruction of the whore of Babylon and all these things. In September 1522, when the translation was published for the first time, you could see the whore of Babylon identified as the Pope with the Triple Crown.
But the prophecy war was just heating up. The church struck back, attacking Luther with its own vicious interpretation of a biblical prophecy. It was the New Testament prediction that a false prophet would come, a servant of the devil. Scholars had even calculated the precise date when this charlatan would arrive.
The prediction was quite clear that the false prophet, by some calculations, which were pretty generally accepted, would be born in 1483, which was, of course, the year of birth of Luther. Now, as soon as Luther had become this rebel monk in the eyes of Rome and the man who wrecked the universal church, it was quite clear that writers in Italy, with the knowledge of these prophecies, would make the most of it and would explain that Luther, of course, was this false prophet who had been predicted.
The church published material showing Luther, the false prophet, as the mouthpiece of the devil. Reformers moved quickly to clear his name.
One of his friends went allegedly to Luther's mother and said, "Are you sure he was born in 1483? Couldn't he have been born in 1484? So that, you know, he would get rid of that curse of prophecy."
Luther's birth date wasn't his only problem. He was now being challenged not only by the church, but by more radical sects within the Reform movement. These people believed the world had become evil in its ways and wanted nothing less than the complete destruction of the society around them. To support their extremist views, they needed look no further than the Bible, in particular, the Book of Revelation. The final chapter in the New Testament tells of nothing less than the violent end to history itself. It is the story of the greatest battle imaginable, an epic confrontation between the forces of good and the forces of evil, the Battle of Armageddon. Written at the time the Christians were being persecuted by the Romans, it promises a final victory for God and his servants. Christ will come again and reign over God's kingdom on earth for 1,000 years, leading up to the Last Judgment. This 1,000-year kingdom of heaven on earth is called the Millennium. The belief that the apocalypse, and thus the millennium, is at hand, is called millenarianism.
It's a decidedly lurid view that Christians had of the last days. Their opponents, notably the Roman Empire, its representatives and so on, but in a sense, everybody who isn't them, and most unpleasant time, they're cast down into the pit of fire and brimstone. The Christians, on the other hand, of course, have a very fine time. And at the Last Judgment, their bodies are transformed and made immortal. And during the millennium, the 1,000 years before the Last Judgment, they are not, they still have bodies, but they have unaging bodies. And so that's also very satisfactory.
Peace and harmony on earth, the return of Christ the King. This would be their reward for keeping faith through persecution. In this final episode of the great moral fable of history, the good could look forward to an eternity of divine bliss, while knowing their enemies would get what they deserved. To an oppressed people like the Christians in the Roman era, such an idyllic epilogue to history must have had an enormous appeal. Following Christ's death, Christianity grew from the religion of one small Jewish sect to the state religion of the Roman Empire and eventually most of the Western world. The Church saw no reason to give up its power and worldly goods in a final judgment. They began distancing themselves from millenarianism.
It had rich monasteries, it had every kind of privilege. Well, the last thing you want to happen is for all this suddenly to come to an end. So What happened to the Book of Revelation then it was turned into a kind of allegory. The 1,000 years of the millennium, that was the present reign of the church. And, well, it was going on for 1,000 years. You didn't worry too much about what would happen at the end of that 1,000 years.
But the prophecies in the book of Revelation are vague and could be interpreted to fit any time of chaos and corruption. The Church of Rome had rejected millenarianism, but radical reformers in the 16th century saw in the disorder around them signs that the apocalyptic battle was about to begin.
In the later Middle Ages, this occurred again and again. You would get a huge rising of peasantry. What they were aiming at was invariably, they were aiming at practical, realizable aims. They wanted the restoration of rights, ancient rights of which they'd been deprived. They wanted better living conditions and so on. Things which could reasonably have some hope of being achieved. Then on the edge of these movements, there turned up some prophet, usually a man of learning, not himself one of the poor, and he would put himself at the head of some small group who were usually the poorest of the poor or unemployed or superfluous population. He would organize them into a new kind of group, and this kind of group would try to bring about, to help God to bring about this total transformation of the world.
In Germany in 1524, large numbers of peasants took up arms against the authorities, including the Catholic Church, in a struggle for better living conditions. In time, their peasants' revolt would capture the attention of a self-proclaimed prophet, Thomas Müntzer. Müntzer was on the radical fringe of the Protestant Reformation. A millenarian in the extreme, he believed in using the sword to destroy God's enemies and so pave the way for Christ's second coming. His prime target was the Catholic Church. But in effect, everyone who rejected his interpretation of Scripture was an enemy. Müntzer preached that the bloody chaos of the peasants' revolt was proof that the end of history was near. Assuring them they had God on their side, he took a small army of believers to join the fight against the evil of church and state. He saw himself as the prophet of apocalypse.
Oh, how ripe the rotten apples are. Oh, how tender the elect have become. The time of harvest is at hand. That is why God himself has hired me for his harvest. I have sharpened my sickle, for my thoughts are focused only on the truth. And my lips, my skin, my hands, my hair, my soul, my body, and my life curse the unbelievers. Have no consideration for the misery of the ungodly. They will beg and whine like children. Do not be merciful. Do not let your sword cool.
Müntzer led his troops into battle, confident the cannons of evil could do them no harm. His followers were quickly killed. Müntzer himself escaped, but was later found and beheaded. The use of vague prophecies by people with radical political aims did not end with the close of the 16th century. In 1939, a German woman came across an occult book containing quatrains written by Nostradamus. The 400-year-old prophecies seemed to describe her country so precisely, she showed the book to her husband. Her husband was Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister for propaganda.
In a place not far from Venice, the two strongest in Asia and Africa, from the Rhine and Hitler, they will be said to have come, weeping at Malta and the Ligurian coast.
Goebbels was excited by the idea that so famous a prophet seemed to have predicted the coming of Adolf Hitler. The potential for propaganda seemed enormous. Experts in the occult were put to work, interpreting the quatrains to predict victory for Germany in the war and provide historical legitimacy for the goals of the Third Reich. Goebbels even had the revised predictions dropped behind enemy lines to demoralize Allied soldiers. If a prophet from the 16th century had predicted the Third Reich, this would support the Nazi view that Hitler's vision of a new and perfect Germany was written into the laws of history, that the Nazi rise to power was no accident. It was meant to be. But Nostradamus did not name the Nazi leader. In the original quatrain, the word is Hister, not Hitler, as it is often interpreted. And Hister in Nostradamus's time was the name given to the lower Danube River. The influence of prophecy in history has been great. It has been the foundation of the major world religions. It has inspired kings, justified wars, and shaped public opinion. It has been a tool for political and religious reformers, as well as for extreme millenarians of all kinds. It could not have played any of these roles if it did not satisfy some deep human need. In times of disorientation, and in communities which are isolated or oppressed, prophecy flourishes.
What is reassuring is that if they've been foreseen, if these dreadful catastrophes which you now as a nation are suffering, if they've been foreseen, they are somehow part of the plan of things. They are not totally random. The awfulness in the world has been foreseen. The way of mankind may be rough, but it's not totally dark.
Prophecy gives history meaning, making of it a sweeping epic saga with universal significance and a strict moral context. There is a part and a place for everyone. With the end of the 16th century, the medieval worldview, and with it the belief in prophecy, came under attack. But the need to see ourselves as central to the cosmos, and the belief that our history must have some meaning, have continued to find expression in our lives. If history is a story, then it must have an ending. As we approach the year 2000, interest in prophecy is on the rise. The only prediction Nostradamus ever tied to a specific date is about to be put to the test.
In the year 1999 and 7 months, from the sky will come a great king of terror. He will bring to life the great king of the Mongols. Before and after, war reigns happily.
But whatever Nostradamus thought this referred to, it is not the end of the world. In his writings, he made predictions for the next 1,000 years and beyond. The future will always be uncertain, and the need that prophecy has spoken to throughout history remains very much alive.